The teen years are the most dangerous period in our life. You're 3 times more likely to suffer serious injury or death during this period than compared to childhood or later in life in adulthood. This is not by chance. Science has actually shown that the innate changes to the way the brain develops during this period causes these risk-taking behaviours. So the question is, can we support the exploration of new things while minimising the chance of permanent harm to our teens? So teens make up the largest group of people with avoidable causes of death. Risky or dangerous behaviours can lead to permanent injuries or fatalities, accidents, drug use, wounding from weapons, suicide, and even murder. And the reality is that many teens act in extreme ways, risk life and limb, harming their own and others' lives in irreversible ways. If they're not taking risks, then they're rebelling against authority, parents, teachers, and so on. So why do teens take unnecessary risks and don't seem to learn from their mistakes? Well, from an evolutionary point of view, this makes total sense. This kind of behaviour is completely predictable. And during this time of life, when the young try and separate from the comfort and safety of their parents, experimental behaviour is actually really important and completely healthy because it helps teenagers to establish their autonomy. But the problem is, during this period, they have an underdeveloped frontal cortex. So this part of the brain just behind your eyes, called the frontal lobes, is underdeveloped. And this part of the brain is the one that controls conscious, rational thought, regulates their emotions, and regulates their drive for pleasure as well, and also controls planning ahead for the future. This is why teens have so much trouble seeing ahead, understanding the consequences of their actions, and are not equipped to weigh up the relative harms of risky behaviour. So while risky behaviour has been the hallmark of adolescence for millennia, today's world poses greater challenges than at any other point in human history. There's increased risk via social media, the internet, and travel, and even travelling around the world is part of every teen's life in the modern world. So left to their own devices, teens can frequently access stressful, inappropriate, and even dangerous information on the internet. And the problem is, at this time of life, they're actually incredibly vulnerable to the power of suggestion. And they have a lot more suggestion at their fingertips now than ever before. And substance abuse is much more, substances of abuse are much more readily available than they have been in the past. You only have to send a text to gain instant access to some source of illicit drugs. So in this lesson, we're going to discuss 3 neuroscience reasons. So 3 reasons that you can explain in terms of brain function of why teens take risks, why they take extreme risks. And the first one is that the teenage brain is really driven by pleasure. And the second thing is their brain is not really wired yet to learn from the mistakes that they make. And the third thing is the teenage brain is highly susceptible to addiction and driving addictive behaviours. And we'll finish up with some neuroscience inspired and some psychological strategies to help you manage risk-taking in your teen's life and try and guide them towards healthier behaviours. The anticipation of pleasure is what drives adolescents to take risk. It's not really the perception of risk that drives their risk-taking behaviour. It's gratification is at the heart of adolescent impulsivity. Adolescents who engage in risky behaviours but have never or rarely experienced the consequences are much more likely to keep repeating those reckless behaviours in search of further gratification. And these reward-seeking impulses are located deep inside the brain in 2 brain areas called the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. So these brain structures belong to the brain's pleasure center because they are responsible for releasing a brain chemical called dopamine. When your teenager contemplates or anticipates pleasures like eating, food, obtaining money, taking drugs, and so on. And their nucleus accumbens alerts them to the possibility of pleasure and motivates them to experience that pleasure. And the pleasure neurons, or these dopamine neurons, are much more active in teenage brains than they are in adult brains. And because their frontal lobe, as I mentioned, is not fully developed yet, it's not fully connected up to the rest of the brain, it's not fully connected up to the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. So it's not able to quieten down these pleasure neurons, and this is what can drive this risk-taking behavior. So the second thing is that the teenage brain is not yet wired up to learn from its mistakes. Adults are much better at learning from mistakes thanks to the brain areas like a structure called the anterior cingulate that sits deep in the middle of the brain. And this brain structure has a unique position in the brain because it has access to the frontal conscious thinking parts of the brain and also the emotional parts of the brain. So it kind of acts as a mediator between those two parts of the brain. And its main job is to monitor your behavior to detect mistakes. So we know from quite a number of brain imaging studies now that have shown that if an adult makes errors and mistakes, this part of the brain, the cingulate cortex, lights up and is saying, better not do that again. But this part of the brain is still being wired up in teenagers. So this makes it much more difficult for them to recognize a mistake and to then learn from it. Which explains why they often take the same risks without learning the sort of consequences of themselves, like hurting themselves or others. So the third thing that I wanted to share with you in this lesson is that the teenage brain is much more susceptible to addiction and addictive behaviours than the adult brain. So this brain structure that I've mentioned, the nucleus accumbens, is much more susceptible to the powers of addiction in the adolescent brain compared to an adult brain. And addiction happens because a drug or another pleasurable stimulus strongly activates the connections between these pleasure neurons, between these dopamine neurons. And addiction is actually a specialized form of learning and memory. So these neurons respond by strengthening their connections, which causes more dopamine to be released to each pleasurable experience. So more and more dopamine is needed in the brain to achieve the same pleasure. And this is actually how craving builds up, which happens much, much faster in a teenage brain. So addiction is actually hardwired into the adolescent brain, and as rehabilitation centres around the UK and worldwide will know, detox is much more of a challenge and often fails more often in adolescence. So risk and reward are inextricably linked in the teenage brain. Teenagers have a superb cognitive and thinking abilities and high rates of learning, and they're still riding on this kind of heightened period of what we call brain plasticity, or heightened period of learning that happens during childhood. And this gives them a distinct advantage over adults because they are primed to learn. But they're also vulnerable to learning the wrong things. This is caused by our brain's craving for rewards and the fact that anything can be learned, good or bad, and that stimulates the production of dopamine, which is construed by the brain as a reward. And this means that a little bit of stimulation to a teenage brain whose neurons are firing all over the place leads to craving for more stimulation. And we call this overlearning, but this is more commonly known as addiction. So we're going to finish up with a home exercise, as we will in all of the lessons. And in this case, to try and help you understand your teenagers' risky behaviours in terms of their brain function, but also to try and implement some strategies to help them with their risk taking and try and produce that in kind of safer environments and contexts.
So now, as with lesson 1, we're going to finish with a set of strategies to try out at home with your teenager. This section of our lessons is designed to help you put into practice your new understanding of why your teenager behaves in the ways they do, and to improve your relationship with them. So, the first strategy in relation to your teenager's risky behaviours is to try and remember that these behaviours are driven by the brain and its out of control desire for reward and pleasure. This is not always easy to do, but if we can accept this and the idea that our teenagers are not necessarily in conscious control of their behaviour, it helps us to have more empathy towards them. And this can then be conveyed to them when we're trying to support them in displaying new or different behaviours. Secondly, we can try and encourage positive risk-taking in safer environments. What this means is looking for ways of meeting the same need for pleasure and reward, but in less risky ways. The exact strategy here is going to be specific to your teenager's circumstances, but it could include something like engaging them in an extreme sport like skateboarding or mountain biking, as these kinds of activities produce the same dopamine rush as many street drugs. Thirdly, try and be their cognition, their thinking brain, because this is the bit that's still maturing. Importantly, we need to remember to do this when they are well regulated emotionally. This means when they're calm and in control of their emotions, rather than when they're angry or upset and out of control of their emotions. Because when they're well regulated, they can engage with you better and their thinking brain is more able to hear what you're trying to say to them. In this strategy, being their cognition means helping them to have a narrative around their behaviour, understanding where it might come from, what the consequences of it might be, and what could they do differently the next time. Share with them what you're learning about their brain so that they can understand themselves better, and remember this is not going to give them an excuse for their behaviour, but it will help them to become more aware of what they're doing and the impact of this. Sometimes you might not know why they are doing what they're doing, and they may not know either. However, we can be curious with our ideas and guesses, and sometimes we might be wrong and sometimes we might be right. The fourth strategy is to replace harmful risky behaviours with healthy behaviours like exercise. These behaviours can become equally as addictive, but are obviously going to have more positive consequences than negative. There's lots of evidence of the benefits of exercise on our mood and on our mental well-being. And this can come from something simple like dancing along to a favourite song through to a more rigorous and regular exercise regime. Either way, movement regulates us emotionally. And when we feel better in our bodies in this way, we feel better in our brains and can be more in control of our behaviour. Hopefully this offers you some ideas to start trying out with your teenager around their risky behaviours. And remember that motivating them to make changes will be easier if we make sure we're still focused on reward and pleasure rather than on punishment. If you feel comfortable doing so, please share any of your observations or thoughts with us in the comments. We'd love to hear about your experiences with your teenager and how you're finding these lessons help you to understand and relate to them better. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.